Thank you so much for that introduction, and I would like to start by thanking the conference organizers for this invitation. I feel very honored and a bit overwhelmed to be speaking amongst such a distinguished panel of people who've really been working for a long time, and I'm especially in the context that I'm a newcomer to refugee and humanitarian aid. I'm also a newcomer to the region. I'm not from Serbia or the Balkans, and I'm not even from Europe, so I'm kind of twice over an outsider, so I feel very honored to be here. And so with that as a background, that I am a guest, I want to sort of begin with a disclaimer that these are simply some observations that I've been making as an observer. I have been involved in field work for a while, as well as what we call online field work with a variety of different organizations. But of course, observations are always flawed, and feel free, of course, to challenge any and all of these. And again, I'm just one, I'm a co-founder. I'm not the founder, but I'm co-founder of this organization, but we're just one organization in a country that has a history of civil society and grassroots. So with those disclaimers, I would like to jump into my discussion, which is focused more on the regional and even, if I may, on a global level, in terms of, I would like to talk a bit more about ideology and these sorts of factors that are influencing volunteering both inside and outside of Serbia. So for instance, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, this difficulty and these challenges of getting particularly local volunteers involved in refugee work, especially in field work outside of major cities. And ultimately, a lot of these challenges, of course, media plays a role, and willingness to, and kind of familial pressure or community pressure plays a role, but also economics plays a role in this, because many local volunteers, I worked as a university lecturer for about a year and a half in Niš, and many of my students wanted to get involved, but they didn't have the economic privilege to take time away from their jobs, to spend money on a hotel, to go to these areas and spend large amounts of time. And so this ended up in a higher representation of foreign volunteers, and volunteers who often hailed from more economically privileged areas. And so this is kind of what I would like to talk about, especially since we're discussing, self-criticism and critical self-reflection as an international kind of volunteer who's occupying this in-between space. I would like to turn the critical lens onto us and onto these discourses that are affecting and will continue to affect volunteering in the refugee crisis and in the crisis of Europeanness, as we've discussed. So I'm sure many of you have seen plenty of critiques of voluntourism and humanitarian selfies and this sort of uncomfortable undercurrent and motivation for a lot of volunteering. And this is a very lively discussion, of course, for people who are volunteering in the refugee crisis. And of course, I'll go back to sort of Rafia Zakaria's seminal piece in Al Jazeera talking about the white savior, the white tourist burden about voluntourism. And so she says, this imagined simplicity of others' problems present a contrast to the intangible burdens of post-industrial societies. Western nations are full of well-fed individuals plagued by less explicit hardships, such as the disintegration of communities and the fraying relationships against the possibilities of endless choices. The burdens of manic consumption and unabated careerism are not as easily pitied as crumbling shanties and begging babies, or in our context, lines and lines of people asking for food, begging for water. Against this landscape, volunteerism presents an escape, a rare encounter with an authenticity sorely missed. Hardship palpably and physically felt for a small price. And with this context, we all are familiar with this discourse, but I would like to present this also as a series of nested ideologies, because we're not only talking about volunteering with refugees, we're talking about existing in and volunteering in a region loosely termed the Balkans, which has its own discourse and has its own has a lens that's projected onto it. From my observations, especially from volunteers hailing from my part of the world and volunteers from Germany and Austria and France. So for this portion of the discussion, I have to turn to Maria Todorova and her coining of the term Balkanism as a sort of parody or complement to Orientalism. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Edward Said's concept of Orientalism, but it's, you know, unpacking a series of pejorative ideologies held by outsiders towards the quote-unquote Orient, and Todorova goes further and kind of tries to customize this to the views of the Balkans. So she discusses how outsiders often view, rooted in this concept, again, of Eurocentrism, which is a very interesting concept if we're talking about the Balkans as a part of Europe as well, which is true. And it can be extended to Amerocentric ideas, which portray the Balkans as semi-colonial, inherently peripheral, tragic, backwards, savage, a place where things happen to it, as opposed to a place where people have actions. And this was completely evident in the attitudes of volunteers coming here. Coming in and assuming that there was no civil society. Volunteers assuming that, you know, everyone would be listening and in the throes and subject to the ideology of their government, that they had no choice of their own. Of course, in the context of volunteering in Serbia and at the Hungarian border and at the Macedonian border and at the Croatian border, the concept of the tragic dissolution of Yugoslavia was always a discourse that was silently happening, and this was a massive impediment for regional and international cooperation, because it meant that local volunteers were ignored and erased and had to fight two battles. They were trying to, or multiple battles, even more than two, dealing with, you know, the typical intra-group, I'll say strife, in terms of different volunteers and what happens when people brush up against people, as well as dealing with the stress of delivering aid, as well as dealing with the stress of a bunch of foreigners. And I was put in a position of being kind of a liaison between foreigners and local volunteer movements to bridge that gap. And additionally, when we look at unequal discourses and a lack of privilege, this also influences the idea of rights to labor, where the less empowered or those who have the lens projected upon them are viewed as owing the external, and in this case often uncritical and objective viewer, labor. So volunteers coming in and demanding local knowledge, demanding local understanding, demanding that local volunteers drop everything and start to assist them. So I feel, from my perspective, you know, especially when these foreign volunteers would ostensibly try to erase this difference by invoking refugees. We just need to put our differences aside and focus on refugees. Why are we focusing on the needs of the local community? So I don't have solutions for this, but I feel that it's a situation that we need to begin to address, that needs to be addressed more vocally, because as we know, volunteers, local, regional, and international, have played and will continue to play a really key and vital role in support of refugees. And so the focus of this conference is a pathway to European solidarity, and taking efforts to address these ideological lenses that are affecting volunteerism and creating problems across the region is going to be one step forward on that pathway. So thank you for your time.